Alright, so to get the mountains moving and animating, because my mountains are significantly bigger than my stage, I'm going to zoom out so I can see what's going on, and I am going to unlock my mountains layer so I can select them and move them over. So now I have my mountains moved over, and if I want to animate them, because they are a movie clip, I can right click on my mountains or right click in my timeline and select Create Motion Tween. One thing to keep in mind is if my layer is locked and I try to do it, I won't get an option to select Motion Tween. If I right click in the layer, you'll see that Create Motion Tween is grayed out. So when the layer is locked, that's a really good indicator that, or when Create Motion Tween shows up gray, it's a good indicator your layer is locked. It's good to work with your layers locked, but sometimes you forget to unlock and can't figure out why you can't select Create Motion Tween. So now Create Motion Tween, and it defaults to 24 seconds. The default time span that gets added to your project is 1 second. If your frame rate was 1 frame per second, it would not even add any frames. If it's 12 frames per second, it would add 12. If you had 120 frames per second, it would have just added 120 frames to your project. So that's why it started at 24. Now I know that that's not going to be enough frames for what I want to have happen, but I'm going to move my mountains over anyway. Now I want my mountains to move in a horizontal manner. I have two options available to me. One, I can move them and keep track of them in the property palette and numerically make sure I maintain the same Y value. The other option is to hold the Shift key when I start dragging, and that will prevent me from dragging my mountains up or down, making it look like the camera was unsteady during my panning action. So now I can see I have my mountains moving across the stage, and they're happening in the span of 1 second. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to test my movie, and we'll see that they're moving really, really fast. So we need to slow that down a little bit. So animation is change over time. The speed of movement is an effect of how much distance over how much time. So if I know my mountains are going to cover this much distance and I want it to slow down, I need to give my animation more time. And I can do that by bringing my mouse down into my timeline, going to the last frame of my tween, and I can just stretch that out. So if I stretch it out to 100 frames, when before it was 24 frames, now I've slowed it down to a much more manageable speed. So that's the first step. Now you may have noticed that there's a slight problem that my ground and sky are disappearing. But that's an easy thing to rectify because I can just click out in the timeline on those layers, hit F5 on the keyboard, that adds in the frames so that they now continue to survive. And we can see I've now created the illusion of my mountains moving, or more accurately, I've created the illusion of a camera moving across the scene. Alright, so while you're working, it's really important again to save. Now something else to keep in mind, if as you're going suddenly you realize you click on something and the whole world goes gray. Your artwork is there but the world goes gray and you're like, whoa, where'd my layers, where'd my timeline and all that stuff go? Then yeah, that's going to be problematic. I think I just moved my artwork too. So I didn't mean for that to happen. But if I unlock my house layer, if I double click on the house, we can see that, oops, there's my house, the ground, the sky, the mountains, everything disappeared. So that's problematic. If we go back to scene 1, go into the mountains, we can see, oh wait, my mountains are on top of my house, but I thought in my layers my house was on top of the mountain. So these are things where it can suddenly become confusing and disorientating. Now what's important to keep in mind is that when you are working in Flash and most other application software, weird things will happen at times. You will lose your bearings and you will start freaking out. The best thing you can do when suddenly it doesn't look right is take your hand off the mouse and keyboard, take a deep breath, and then start looking at what's going on. If you just keep clicking on stuff, it gets ugly really, really fast. So just take a break, take your hands off, do a hand check, and take a breath. Then, what is going to be the first clue is to look up at the top of your screen, and you will see where it says the symbol name you're in, and then scene 1, and you will at that point realize, oh, I jumped into symbol editing mode. This allows me to make updates or changes to something that's already a symbol, and I can see how it compares to the things around it. Now I notice my layers are gone, my frames are all gone, and that's because I'm inside the mountain symbol, which only has one layer and one frame. If I go back to scene 1, I can see there it is. If I go into the house, I can see the same issue. And I can click up top here to go back to scene 1, or just double click outside any artwork and it will bring me back to the main timeline or the main scene. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind. So I want my house to animate, but I'm going to start with it here. So I'm going to animate, and I want my house to come in right about here. So that's frame 50. So when I look at that, I'm going to just grab that first frame, click on it, and then click and drag, and I can drag it right over to frame 50. Now we can see that the house isn't there until frame 50. And then I want to tween the house, so I will right click on it and say create motion tween. Now this time, because I'm not starting at frame 1, you will notice that it did not give me one automatic second of animation. It only gave me one frame. So if I want to give my frame, or give my house more frames, I can just go into the animation, hit F5, and it extends it out. We can now see it's that beautiful blue cyan color indicating it's a motion tween. It's not a boring gray static artwork layer, but it is a tween layer. And I can see that both in the layers section where I have the little tween icon, and I can tell by the blue color. So currently my house isn't on stage yet, but I'm going to animate it on stage and start pulling it over onto my stage. So we can see that now the house comes in. And I need the mountains to stop when the house stops. So because I put this keyframe here, I want to move that to a new place. Now it's not uncommon when you're animating, it puts in a keyframe for you. If you want to move that keyframe, you can't just click on it. You have to hold down the Command key when you're working on Mac, Control key on Windows. That will select just that keyframe, and then I can take that keyframe and move it to a new place. So now my mountains continue moving, my house moves to right there. Let's see how that works now. And the only thing that would be nice is if it stopped at the end. And I can do that by making my animation longer. To make my animation longer, I can extend it out. And I can just simply hit F5. That extends that out. F5, 5, 5. So now it extends it out. Now, what I want to have happen, I've done the first cinematic technique that I wanted to accomplish, which was a panning motion, having the camera move across my scene. Now, what's important about this is when you are trying to create an illusion of space moving or a camera traveling through space, there's a visual effect called parallax. And the simplest explanation is that objects closer to the camera or the viewer will travel faster across your screen than objects in the distance. So if you want to create the illusion of space within your picture, Objects that are far away, make them move slower across the screen. Objects that are closer, make them move faster. And that's going to create a better illusion of spatial movement in your project. So now they come on screen. And the next step I want to do, after I've created that mini parallax effect, is to add in a little bit of zoom. To add in the zoom, I switch to my pre-transform tool. I'm going to go into my timeline for my house, putting the playback head at the point I want it, and I'm going to hit F6 to manually insert a keyframe. Now technically I should be able to grab the zoom tool, scale my object, and it inserts that keyframe for me automatically. My experience with Flash has been that it doesn't always do that, and the moment I scale my artwork, it makes the artwork grow on every keyframe in my tween. But if I put that keyframe in and then scale it, it generally behaves better. Now, I don't want to scale it like that because that's ugly. I don't want to scale it like this because that's ugly. I want to scale it proportionally. To scale it proportionally, if I hold down the Shift key and grab a corner, we can see that it scales up. And make sure that when you do that, that you let go of the mouse before the Shift key. Otherwise, it doesn't work quite right. So now if I scrub the timeline, we'll see I zoom across, and then the house scales up. Now, if the camera were indeed zooming in on this, it would also make sense that there's a slight scale change for my mountains. So I am going to add ever so slightly a zoom. Okay, that wasn't ever so slightly, and it was being difficult with me. Just a very subtle movement, so it starts to further enhance the illusion of the zooming of the camera. Because the mountains are further away, they would not proportionally zoom as much as the house, which is closer to my camera.